Well, there can be times in your life when you can wonder if God is really at work in your life when you can't see him. There are seasons in life where God can seem silent. We pray, but our circumstances don't change. We know God's promises, but our experience seems to contradict them. And we can wonder if God has forgotten us. Now, this is the exact situation that we're faced with in Exodus chapter 2. God had promised Abraham and his descendants that they'd become a great nation and inherit the promised land. But by the time we get to Exodus chapter 2, we have Abraham's descendants living in slavery in Egypt. Pharaoh is oppressing them, Hebrew baby boys are being murdered, and the future seems really bleak. Perhaps the most surprising thing about chapter 2 in Exodus is that God hardly gets a mention. There are no miracles, there's no burning bushes, there's no plagues, there's no dramatic display of divine power. Now, to the average Israelite, it must have seemed as if God was not really there or he didn't really care. Yet behind the scenes, God is quietly working out his purposes. And that's when God seems absent, he is often accomplishing his greatest work. That brings us to the first point of our sermon today, to find God in the ordinary events of life. To find God in the ordinary events of life. Now, our passage begins with the birth of a boy, and straight away we know that he's under threat because Pharaoh's rule that every Israelite boy must be thrown into the Nile River. So look at verses 1 to 4 with me now. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So here we read about a Levite woman who gives birth to a son and decides to hide him for 3 months. Imagine trying to keep your baby son a secret for 3 months. Eventually, she can't hide him any longer. So the mother gives her son up to the Nile River, but by placing him in a basket among the reeds. And Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the river to bathe. A number of years ago, a father told me that when he read this story to his daughter for the first time, when he got to this bit, the daughter held her breath with her hand over her mouth, wondering, will this baby boy die? And this girl has something that we've lost, hasn't she? The innocence of reading this story for the first time. Humanly speaking, the situation did seem hopeless. Pharaoh's ordered the death of all the Hebrew boys, and here's one floating in the Nile. And yet it does seem that God is at work. Instead of destroying the child, Pharaoh's daughter has compassion on him. Even more remarkably, the baby's own mother is hired to nurse him. And when the baby boy is finally grown up, the mother returns him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he becomes her son, and she names him Moses. So here we have Pharaoh, who's trying to eliminate Israel's future, yet God uses Pharaoh's own household to preserve Israel's deliverer. Pharaoh's daughter finances the upbringing of the very man who will one day confront Pharaoh and lead God's people out of Egypt and out of slavery. There is nothing miraculous happening in these verses. There's no parting the waters, there's no fire from heaven. Instead, there's a series of seemingly ordinary events. A mother acting courageously as she seeks to spare her son, a sister watching carefully over her brother floating in the reeds in the Nile, a princess showing compassion on a baby boy, and a child being adopted into the household of Pharaoh. But these seemingly ordinary events reveal God's providence. Providence is God's sovereign rule over every detail of life. He can do it and does work through ordinary circumstances of life to accomplish his purposes. Yet for many Christians, we might long for a dramatic sign of God's activity in my life, while overlooking the countless ways that God has already been at work through the ordinary events of your life. A chance conversation, a job opportunity, a friendship, a timely encouragement, a closed door that later proves to be a blessing. Now for me, the door to full-time vocational ministry firmly closed on me on the 28th of March 2020. But it now gives me the opportunity to serve you and other local churches as I am today. But often we can only recognise God's hand when we look back in the rearview mirror of life. The preservation of Moses reminds us that God is never threatened by the plan of powerful rulers. Kings, presidents, governments may appear strong, but God remains sovereign over them and history and over the ordinary events of your life. That brings us to the next point in the passage, where we ought to be patient with God's plans as we see God shape his servant. So in verses 11, the story about Moses jumps forward. In verse 11, Moses is now 40 years old. He's grown up in Pharaoh's palace, and according to worldly standards, he's got everything to be a success. He's got an education, he's got privilege, he's got status, he's got influence. So why on earth does he kill an Egyptian? Seems like a bad move, doesn't it? But look at verses 11 and 12. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them in their hard labour. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, it's clear from these verses that Moses still knows that he belongs to God's people. The next day, Moses attempts to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews, asking one of them, why is he hitting a fellow Hebrew? And this guy says to Moses, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I have done must have become known. Now, some might think, that Moses is a violent man, as this Hebrew did. But the way Moses has been remembered in Scripture is quite different. Have a look at Stephen's speech. Now, Stephen was the first Christian martyr in the church, but before being martyred, he gave us this speech. And in Acts chapter 7, verses 23 to 26, he says this: when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defence and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realise that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Man, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" Now, here in this verse, we discover that Moses saw himself as a deliverer of God's people. He rescues one from the hand of an Egyptian, and he seeks to rescue the relationship of two Hebrews. But the question, who made you ruler and judge over us, stings, because nobody has made him ruler or judge, at least not yet. Because God is not finished with Moses. News of what Moses had done reaches Pharaoh, and in verse 15 we read this. When Moses heard this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So now Moses has become a man without a home and without a people. He's become a fugitive, and he flees to the neutral territory of Midian. Now, from a human perspective, Moses' life seems to have fallen apart. And even here in this situation, he can't help himself but to rescue. Look at verses 16 and 17. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flocks. Now, after rescuing these 7 daughters from some other shepherds, he meets their father, Reuel, who encouraged this so-called Egyptian to stay. And then we read in verses 21 to 22, Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. So, here we have this once prince of Egypt become a shepherd. This future leader of Israel will spend the next 40 years, so he was 40 when the incident happened with the Egyptian and the Hebrew. He's going to spend another 40 years as a foreigner in a foreign land. But it seems that God was shaping his servant. Before Moses can lead Israel, he needs to learn humility. Before he can shepherd God's people, he needs to become a shepherd. Before he can trust God's power, he must learn the inadequacy of his own power. These 40 years were not wasted years. God is patient, working on Moses. Yet sometimes, in our lives, we long for more immediate results. Maybe wanting to see some significant growth in a Christian ministry that you're involved in, or maybe wanting a resolution to a long-term sickness, or maybe getting the dream job that will support your family, or maybe wanting a Christian partner to share life with. We want it now. One such person who longed for more immediate results was the Reverend Richard Johnson. If you don't know who Richard Johnson is, he arrived in Sydney as the chaplain to the colony of New South Wales with the First Fleet in 1788. He wrote to his mentor, John Newton. You know John Newton of Amazing Grace fame? He wrote about the opposition that he faced in terms of the gospel ministry that he was conducting here in Sydney. And this was John Newton's reply to him. I have not been disheartened by your apparent want of success. I have been told that skillful gardeners will sow and raise a salad for dinner in the short time while the meat is roasting. But no gardener can raise oaks with such expedition. You are sent to New Holland not to sow salad seeds, but to plant acorns, and your labour will not be lost. Though the first appearance may be very small and the progress very slow, you are, I trust, planting for the next century. I have good hope that your oaks will spring up and flourish and spread among the islands and the nations of the southern seas. And here you are now, here in this church building, one of those acorns planted by Richard Johnson back in 1788, and you now stand as an oak tree in the parish of Sadleir. Many of us who've been around for long enough will know what it's like to experience disappointment, failure, to have an unexpected detour in life. A career doesn't unfold as planned, a ministry opportunity disappears, relationships change, a dream is delayed. And yet it is often in these periods of trial that God often does his deepest work in our lives. Therefore, we need to be patient with God's plan. 40 years in Midian were not a pause in God's plan for Moses. They were part of God's plan for Moses. That brings us to the final point of our sermon, that your cries are heard. Look at verses 23 to 25 with me as we return to the Israelites back in Egypt. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cries for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Nothing much has changed for these Israelites in these 40 years. The Pharaohs changed, but their suffering continues. Their slavery remains. Their oppression has not ended. Yet something does change. The people groan under their burden and cry out to God. And then we get these 4 wonderful statements. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked on the Israelites and God was concerned about them. In the first 2 chapters of this book, God has hardly got a mention, but in these final 2 verses, God gets mentioned 4 times. And we discover that God is not untouched or unmoved by the Israelites' plight. And it's not as though God had forgotten all about them and then suddenly remembers them. In Scripture, when it says that when God remembers, it means that he's going to act according to his covenant promises, the promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this includes the promise that God made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. Look at these verses with me. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." God had not abandoned Abraham's descendants. He'd not ignored their suffering. He had not lost control. He remembered. It will have seemed like to the enslaved Israelites that nothing was happening. But God had been preparing a deliverer the moment Moses was born. The people couldn't see what God was doing. While they suffered in Egypt, God was preserving Moses. While Moses lived in Pharaoh's palace, God was preparing him. When Moses went to live in Midian, God was shaping him. Then God answers their cries. God answers their cries was already in motion long before they realised it. And this can be a great encouragement to believers today, can't it? Sometimes we cry out to God and wonder if he hears us. The diagnosis remains. The grief persists. The family struggle continues. The ministry feels difficult. But Exodus 2 reassures us that God's seeming silence is not absence. He hears, he remembers, he sees, he knows. Ultimately, Exodus 2 points us beyond Moses to our deliverer, Jesus Christ. Like Moses, Jesus was born under the threat of a murderous King Herod. Like Moses, Jesus was rejected by his own people. Like Moses, Jesus came to deliver God's people. But of course, Jesus is greater than Moses, isn't he? Moses will rescue Israel out of slavery in Egypt, but Jesus will rescue us from our slavery to sin and death and so much more. But most importantly, at the cross, it appeared as though God's plan had failed. Jesus was arrested, he was condemned, and he was crucified. Yet what looked like utter defeat was actually God's greatest victory. As Peter says in Acts chapter 2, verses 22 to 24, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited to you by God by miracles, wonders and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep a hold on him. The God who was at work behind the scenes in Exodus was accomplishing our salvation through Jesus Christ on the cross. Exodus chapter 2 is a chapter about God who is quietly but powerfully at work. When Moses was hidden in that basket, God was quietly at work. When Moses fled to Midian, God was quietly at work. When Israel groaned in slavery, God was quietly at work. Even though God's people couldn't see God's hands quietly working, they still called on him. And maybe there are some of you here today, and you might be feeling as though God doesn't know how your life is going at this present time. You might feel as though God doesn't seem to care where you're at. But Exodus chapter reminds us that God is not absent. Rather than waiting for a big gesture from God, why don't you look back and see God's hand in the ordinary events of your life? Rather than wanting to see your circumstances change right now, why not be patient with God's plans? And rather than wondering if your prayers are heard, why don't you recall that he hears, he remembers, he sees, and he knows. The God who preserved Moses is the same God who saved us through Jesus Christ. And even when we can't see what God is doing in our lives now, we can trust that he is at work for the good of his people and for the glory of his name. Let me pray.